Hey there, this is Alvalyn Lundgren, and this is Introduction to Graphic Design. Episode 8, we're talking about design as visual communication. So our understanding about graphic design being visual communication has to be built on a foundation of how people receive and catch what's being communicated to them. We understand that most of the information we receive every day comes visually. So the idea of understanding the form language and how people understand visual information is crucial to successful design. So back in the early 1900s, a group of psychologists were looking at the ways in which human beings actually address and comprehend and apprehend visual information. And based on their observations and studies, they developed a set of principles which describe how we see things visually. These principles pertain to all human beings, all places, all throughout history, no matter what culture. It's basically, if you're human, this is how you function. Just like our visual apparatus is all in common, bodily systems, our skeletal structure, we all have these in common because we're human beings. And so that's what gestalt theory and gestalt design theory address. It's also important to note that gestalt theory confirms aesthetic theory or design principles, design theory. So the things you learn in a course like Fundamentals of Design, those principles are also universal because they pertain to how we understand our world visually and how we navigate and negotiate. So let's look at some of those principles, because knowing the Gestalt principles will help you design better. Your designs will be more successful. The basic premise is that Gestalt deals with visual organization. When we see something, our brain goes through a process of organizing in order to understand, and then in order to understand, we ascribe meaning, and then we can make decisions about what we're seeing. Gestalt itself is a German term meaning the whole thing. It deals with the idea that when we look at something, we deal with the entire thing that we're seeing all at once. So we see the whole forest, to use that idiom, before we see the individual trees. Gestalt bears within its meaning the idea of completeness or wholeness. And there are certain premises that underlie the Gestalt principles we're going to talk about. And one of them is that every human being is innately creative. And creativity, the ability to bring something into being, the ability to problem solve, the ability to innovate, is unique to humanity. We are each naturally creative. Now the thing is, we're not all creative in the same way. Some of us are visually creative. Others are creative in terms of the written word. Others are creative in terms of movement and dance. Others are creative in terms of systems and processes. So creativity is an inherent human trait, but each one of us bears it out a little bit differently. But we are all creative. To say that you are not creative is actually contradicting your human nature. All human beings look at things and try to figure them out. What do they mean? And that includes not just what does that mean, it's what does that mean to me personally? What does that mean to my life and my lifestyle? What does that mean to my worldview? Can I use that? Can I acquire that? Can I make that work for me? So every time we look at something, we ascribe meaning to it. And when things aren't relevant to us, we ignore them. Within our visual field, we automatically separate an object from the background. So this is a way we see. It's a function that allows us to focus on one thing at a time. And then when we switch to another thing, we focus on that and we're no longer focusing on the first thing. We automatically separate objects from their background. That is to help us understand space. That helps us understand what's going on in front of us. When we're driving down the freeway, we have to be able to automatically separate the car ahead of us from the cars around us. This is something that we're wired to do, and it's a good thing. But we use that as designers because we understand that we see only one figure ground relationship at a time. It's impossible to see two figure ground relationships at a time. We will switch back and forth between one or the other, but we can't see both at once. It's kind of like the idea of multitasking, where you can do two or three different things all at the same time. That's an absolute myth. You can't. You focus on one thing, then you switch to another thing, then you go back to the first thing, and we might think we're multitasking because we seem to be doing two or three things at once, but we're really doing one thing at a time for a little bit, and then we'll shift to doing another thing for a little bit, and then we'll go back to the first thing. We are not wired, we're not created to truly multitask. We're not created to truly see more than one thing at a time. Another premise about gestalt principles and design theory is that balance is a requirement. Balance, excellence, wholeness, completeness, those are all interrelated, and we automatically expect things to be balanced and things to be complete. The reason is we need things that way. When something's not balanced in our visual field, it feels off. It feels uncomfortable. We may not be able to figure out what's going on, but there's just something there that's just not right. These are the kind of foundational ideas, and there's a lot more than these, but these are crucial ones for us to understand moving forward and looking at principle by principle. So one of the principles that designers can take great advantage of is the idea of proximity. When we're trying to create focal points and move a viewer's eye through a website or through a printed design, proximity helps us read text. Proximity helps us understand what relates to something else and what doesn't relate to that something. So proximity is something we deal with all the time. We basically group together things that are located or positioned close to each other, and they are seen as a single unit and as belonging together. If you think about how we talk about, say, in baseball, the pitcher, the catcher, the shortstop, the outfielders, the infielders, we can talk about them individually, but more often we're going to talk about them as a team. So we talk about the team rather than individual players. So the team is a singular thing, whereas individual players is plural. The idea of proximity is kind of the same way. Things that are close together become one thing, and we understand them as belonging together, even though they may look different. So here we're seeing this grouping, and then there's a large gap of white space, and then there's this grouping. So these three belong together, and these six belong together. The principle of similarity observes that we will see things that are similar in appearance, that have similar visual characteristics as belonging together, and those that are different will stand out. So again, with similarity, we can create focal points and emphasis and highlight information. With similarity, the things that stand out or the things that are different will contrast. So in the top grouping here, this stands out from all the other things like it because of the color, and we will notice it first. This stands out because of shape difference. And here we just have the shape difference. So there are 2 points of difference here. There's 1 point of difference here. Which is the stronger point of difference? The stronger point of difference is the circle versus the square, because it is most different. Just changing the color on something that's the same shape is a point of difference. It's a contrast, but it is not as great a contrast as actually changing the shape and the characteristics of the shape. So with similarity, things that are alike or closely alike are closely associated. When things move in the same direction, they're seen as belonging together. When they look alike or they have very similar characteristics, they are seen as belonging together. Figure ground, already talked about a little bit, is an automatic perception. We automatically separate something from its background. So as we look at the turquoise square, we see it as being on top of or in front of the black background. But then we can take this whole thing, the small square within the larger black square, and it separates from the white ground of the slide. So we will see this to this, or we'll see all of this to this. Where there is less contrast, that separation is harder to see. So now we've darkened the colors so that the figure ground separation is not as strong and understanding. This is another difficult to pronounce word, but it's pregnans. It's the idea of simplicity. It relates to Occam's razor or the law of simplicity. We automatically reduce things in our understanding to their simplest form. So the more complex something is to look at, the more likely we are to reduce it so we can understand it simply. We do this as human beings simply because we are dealing with so much information that simplifying information in our minds, in our brains, helps us navigate and helps us deal with the information. You know, if you think about reading a textbook or taking notes on a video lecture, your notes are a simplification of what is being talked about because you're probably not transcribing directly every word that's being said. You're picking out highlights and you're simplifying the information into something that you can deal with more easily. Taking a complex form such as an actual dog into a more simplified form still helps us understand, it still helps us communicate, but it makes it a lot easier to deal with and a lot easier to work with. In the same way, we will see this as all one shape and not a square with 4 circles overlapping the corners and 4 circles subtracting from the square. So we will see this as a complete shape rather than actually 9 different shapes interacting together. Closure is another thing that we do automatically. We make connections between things. Closure gives us the ability to organize space and see implied lines and unite things within a design so that they relate together and they are more capable of expressing the entire idea. Closure is all about when given enough visual information, we will complete what is not complete. When edges or masses or shapes are not joined together, we will psychologically or visualize them as being closed because we are looking for that wholeness or that completeness. So the 2 sets of parallel lines are not a square, but I bet you first thought of square when you saw that. You're simplifying not just the amount of lines in the pregnance idea, but you are actually closing those corners because of the relationship of the lines. But that's not a square. That's 2 sets of parallel lines that are equidistant from each other. You probably would have noticed the ellipse first, which is actually a negative space issue, before you realize that there's 2 irregular shapes here that are working together. They're in relationship with each other and creating that sort of elliptical oval shape within the negative. Continuity is the idea that we will track in a continuous motion. We will track movement. Our eyes will track in one direction until something interrupts that movement. Instead of seeing 4 lines coming together at a common point, we see 2 lines intersecting, and they are intersecting in a perpendicular relationship to each other. So we will start at point A and track to point B. We'll start at point A and track to point B. We will not start at B and stop at point C here in the center. We will keep going. And then the interruption is that the line visually stops. Here, the stars are working together to create an implied line, something that we can't see, but there is a motion along that line, and it's a curved line. We can't see the line, but it's implied by what the objects are doing. And we will track that implied line in the same direction until it is stopped or it changes course. Continuity also relates to the idea of common fate, where things that move in the same direction are seen as a single thing. They are seen as belonging together. So continuity and common fate are interrelated in terms of understanding. Equilibrium. We prefer things that are balanced. We are attracted to symmetry and other forms of balance. we don't appreciate or enjoy things that aren't balanced. We are so wired to be stabilized and secure that anything that's out of balance is a bother. This is not balanced. The two circles are not balanced within the square. This is kind of trying to run out this way, this is trying to run out this way, and there's way too much negative space up here. This is more balanced. We're actually aligning along a diagonal axis from upper right to lower left, and the red circle is accommodating the position of the smaller circle. And these two are relating to the square in a very ordered and balanced and stabilized way. This is another type of balance being used, but this is even more stabilized than this. This has a little more dynamic quality to it. It's a little more interesting. This is a straight shot to the center. We understand, by the way, that every shape and every group of shapes has a gravitational center, and we automatically look for and acknowledge and understand that center. So when you have a figure such as a square, which is equal distance in height and width, that gravitational center is going to be spot on dead center and equidistant from all four sides. And so if you position things there on that gravitational center, you are static but highly stabilized, highly secure, and balanced. Assimilation is also something we need to be aware of. It relates to the idea that we do not design out of nothing. Everything is ultimately an innovation or a modification of something that already exists. So we can go back and forth and have a critical practice and critical thinking discussion on the question, is there really any true original thought, or is there any true originality in design? And essentially, there's not. What we end up doing is taking from one thing and taking from another thing and bringing them together into something new. So with assimilation, it's the idea that we are borrowing from what we already know, utilizing and relying on what we know to make decisions about what's next or to create something new. So what we understand and how we perceive things are all filtered and related to our own past experiences and knowledge. And this is why I can give you all the same assignment, and each of you will come up with a very different visual expression of that assignment. Every individual is unique and has unique experiences that nobody else has, and they're combined in unique ways, and so nobody is the same. We relate to each other based on common ground. We're all human. We're all on the freeway together going the same direction, one way or the other. We all do things very much in the same way. And then there are differences, whether they're individual differences, cultural differences, familial differences. Our perceptions, our understanding of what we're seeing, and our ability to create new things all relate and rely on our own past experience and knowledge. So that should tell you that as a designer, the more you know, the better off you are. The more you have to draw on. If you confine your knowledge to just a narrow pathway or a narrow set of experiences, you are going to miss out on greater possibilities for your work and greater possibilities for your career and your life and accomplishing your goals. For this kind of parody to work, you have to understand that Rembrandt painted like this. Then you can look at this and get the joke. This is based on assimilating art history or design history. So why are gestalt principles important to the graphic designer? Well, because we are human beings, we are designers, we are creating design for human beings. We don't create design for trees or dogs. Even if we're designing a dog collar, the dog doesn't really need the collar. The human needs the collar on the dog to be able to walk the dog. Design is always created by human beings for human beings. If we understand how human beings are wired generally, if we understand our bents and how we see things and how we deal with visual organization and what that's all about, we're able to design effectively, and that's what we want. We're not designing for ourselves. Design is about service to others. It's about communicating. It's about persuading. It's about making other people's lives better. So if you have questions about Gestalt principles, ask them in the comment section. Since graphic design is visual communication, in fact, it's also called visual communication, or it's called design communication or communication design. And we're not designing for ourselves, but for other people. We need to understand, first of all, that we are designing for others, for an audience, the people who are receiving the visual messages that we are sending out, either directly for ourselves or on behalf of our clients or employers. And then how is the audience going to be receiving that information? Because generally, graphic design is done for business purposes. There are very few situations where you are not designing for a business or organization to be able to accomplish their goals, whether it's getting more donors if it's a nonprofit, whether it's increasing their revenue streams and being able to build the company. Graphic design is integral to marketing, advertising, messaging, and overall branding. So we need to design for the audience, and gestalt principles, knowledge of those, is one aspect of designing for the audience. There are other things to keep in mind as well. So first, let's look at a few premises. Designers do not sign their work. Artists get to sign their work. We stand behind our work. Our work sits out there in front of us. We stand behind it. But do you know who designed the logo for McDonald's without having to look it up? Do you know who designed the FedEx logo without having to Google it? Probably not. Designers don't get to sign their work because it's not about the designer. The things you create as a designer are always for the people you're designing for and their audience. The only time you get to design for yourself is when you're doing your own branding and graphic assets such as your logo, your business card, website communication systems. Design is not expressing yourself creatively. It is not edifying yourself creatively. Oh, I'm going to explore what color does in this lighting situation. Or here's a blank canvas, what can I make of it? I'll just, let the canvas speak to me. That's not the approach of a designer. A designer has to look at, okay, what are we trying to do? What purpose are we trying to accomplish? What business problem are we trying to solve? And then let's go do it. How can we solve it in the best way? Design is basically the idea of applying aesthetic principles to solve problems or to meet needs. Graphic design, as opposed to other genres and disciplines of design, solves communication problems. The word graphic comes from graphe, which is to draw or to write in the Greek, and drawing and writing are visual communication efforts. So graphic design is visual communication. You are communicating things to people. When a client comes to you and says, we're launching a new product, we need to let people know about it, that's a communication problem that a graphic designer solves. Graphic design specifically solves business problems because, again, you are dealing with communication visually. Even if you are doing publication or editorial design where it's a book or a magazine, that book or magazine still needs to be laid out in such a way that it communicates well to the audience that you're dealing with. And the author of the book can earn a living, and the magazine can reach its readers, and the staff of the magazine can earn a living, and you can earn a living by being paid by your clients. These are all business problems. There is really nothing that you do as a graphic designer that is not outward focused and that is not commerce focused, commercially focused. This is a print ad from a few years back for Dodge's truck division, its Ram truck division. There's no text. There's nothing explaining anything except the tagline of Dodge and different, separated by the Ram logo. What there is color theory at work in a big way, and shape, and gestalt principles of similarity and proximity and assimilation. So we have all these clovers and they're green. And then we have one 4-leaf clover. All of these are 3-leaf clovers. So that's the assimilation because we're using an idiom. We have a field of green 3-leaf clovers with one 4-leaf clover poking through and highly noticeable because it's bright red. Well, if you have studied color theory at all, you know that red is the complement or the opposite and the balancing point of green. So among all the green 3-leaf clovers, we have the red, totally opposite, highly contrasting 4-leaf clover. That's similarity. We're also seeing proximity because everything is stuck together. The four-leaf clover is not sitting out over here separate. It's in and amongst, and the thing that separates it visually is the color and the shape. So by proximity and similarity, those gestalt principles, we've got something being powerfully communicated here without words. And that is that Dodge Ram trucks are not like Chevy and Ford, or Toyota, or Nissan, or whoever else makes trucks. And all of this is done very powerfully, very simply, very quietly, using image, using color theory, design principles, using gestalt theory, very little text. The audience for this may not understand color theory, may not care about color theory, may not care about design, but they're going to get this just because they will automatically understand that red is standing out from green, and they'll get the metaphor. So when you design, you have an audience always. And your audience is either going to be your client or your creative director or your boss, but they're going to have an audience that they're trying to reach. So when I'm designing, one of the first things I need to understand is who is my client, because I work independently. I work client direct, business to business, and my clients come to me to design things for them that they can use to reach their audience. So there's a triangular relationship there in a way. There's me as the designer, creative director. There's my client who has the need to communicate to their audience, and there's the audience. So that's kind of a three-legged stool, if you will. So who are you ultimately designing for? Certainly not yourself. Are you designing for your client? Well, they're going to be paying you, but ultimately the audience, your audience, is their clients and customers. If you are a staff designer, that audience becomes the design firm's or the ad agency's client. And then their clients are trying to reach a broader audience. So the audience you're designing for might be 2 steps removed in that case. In my situation, and if you are entrepreneurial and going to be freelancing and you're working client direct, then it's only 2 steps away. So here's basically the idea. You have the relationship with the client. The client is telling you all about their audience. You are utilizing that information, but not designing necessarily for the client. You are designing for the people they're trying to reach. So you really need to understand who these people are. An audience is made up of people, and we have to look at people in a couple different ways. There's demographics, which are facts. And facts are age, race, gender, or gender preference, income level, where they're located, what are their interests, what are their hobbies, are they Dodgers fans, are they Angels fans, are they Lakers and to heck with baseball, what's their level of education, all of these things come into play. Those are all facts. Those are external things about the audience. And that's really great. That keeps the audience quite broad, which is very difficult to design for. And it entirely overlooks the fact that people don't make decisions externally. They don't make decisions on facts. People connect to story, people connect to narrative and emotion. So facts can very often be set aside in order to embrace a story, even if the story is not true. And you tell a story often enough, they'll believe it even though it might not be backed up with fact. So facts are only part of the equation, and in terms of impact and hierarchy, they're probably subordinate to psychographics. So psychographics are the internal things. They're somebody's motivations. And they pertain to how people view the world, what their attitudes are, what their aspirations are, the things that they value, what their opinions are, what their lifestyle is like. So psychographics are more important or have more substance when you're designing than mere demographics. What you need to keep in mind as you are designing is how is your design going to influence and communicate to the target audience. Because if you think about it, pretty much everything you do as a designer and put out there, or that you will do as a designer and put out there, you want some response to that. If you build a website, you want people to show up. And why do you want people to show up? Well, they're coming to buy something, or they're coming for information, or they're coming for some sort of transaction, or for a sense of belonging. So there are various reasons that people would show up to a website. How is your design going to influence their experience? You can't just design something and let it hang out there. You have to be strategic in how you place things, in your calls to action, in your typographic hierarchy, in your information hierarchy, in your site architecture. All these things come into play because you have to keep that audience in mind, because that's why you're doing the design in the first place. What do you want the target audience to do? Think about intended results and preferred outcomes. Graphic design is measured on what happens once the design is launched or published. If people are ignoring it, or it's too difficult to figure out, and they can't make meaning out of it, then the design is basically a fail. It can look really good, it can be gorgeous, but if it's not doing what it needs to do, if it's not reaching the audience, if it's not helping them make decisions, or it's not improving their situations, it's not working. A few pointers for creating effective design solutions that people are going to respond to. Going back to that gestalt principle of assimilation, our perceptions are related to past experiences and knowledge. A lot of people will have common experiences. Again, the more you know, the more you have on hand at your disposal to create effective design solutions. I've mentioned this word here and there throughout this discussion. Idiom is one way we can create a bond and impact our audience. So an idiom is a way of expression or a form. It's a common visual, it's a common word that's kind of inherent or natural to a particular group or person or culture. English idioms are things like back to the drawing board, take a leap of faith, or look before you leap. Those seem to contradict each other. Having the best of both worlds, you let the cat out of the bag, you didn't do your homework. So an idiom is something that's common to a particular group of people that has particular meanings, not necessarily based on the words in the idiom, like having the cake and eating it too. So here's an ad that uses the cake idiom to communicate to an audience that is concerned about business growth. Notice that it's balanced. If we're looking at the headline, we're not looking here. If we're looking at the logo, we're kind of ignoring the cake. If we're looking at the cake, we're ignoring the click. Notice that the letter forms group into words. That's proximity. Then there's a space. Then there's another group of words. So proximity and similarity create readability as well as legibility in this design. The idea of things being vintage means that you are taking things from a past era. So when you're dealing with vintage things and you're pulling them forward, you go back to the era, the epoch, the particular style or the movement, and bring it forward and directly forward. And so vintage has an historic, timeless quality to it. Retro, on the other hand, is influenced by past styles, but it's been updated. The psychedelic movement in the 60s and early 70s was based on Art Nouveau and the arts and crafts movement. It was strongly influenced by that. It was strongly influenced by op art, but it made it new. So it was only influenced. It didn't actually use vintage work. Instead, it drew from it and brought it forward and made it current. And so retro is used whenever you want to connect with people emotionally and involve a sense of nostalgia. Paula Scher's Swatch ad was based on a much earlier mid-century Swiss design by Herbert Matter. This is vintage. This is the actual design from mid-century in the international Swiss style, and this is her postmodern updating of it. And of course, Swatch is a Swiss brand. So there's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek there, a little bit of humor going on there too. Parody is imitation with exaggeration for effect. Parody is not plagiarism. Parody is actually something that's allowed under copyright law. If you change something enough, that if you take something that already exists and change it enough, usually with humor, parody is usually for the purposes of pulling a joke on something or on someone or on a group, causing us to laugh at ourselves. We exaggerate to get the effect that we want. And so again, looking at the Rowan Atkinson parodies of well-known paintings created by Rodney Pike, he didn't create the paintings, he created the parodies. The Mona Lisa is sitting here, and then we've got this funky face superimposed on it. It becomes very funny. Pastiche is more of an imitation of a style or borrowing from current or past work. Collage is a pastiche process where you take from things that already exist and incorporate them into a new work. To do it effectively, you have to know what you're doing. So you have to know current and historic trends, styles, and movements. Very famous poster was based off an earlier British poster by Alfred Leeds. Not a direct plagiarism, but very strongly influenced both in image and in sentiment. This contemporary series of posters borrows from Russian constructivism. Shepard Fairey's work is very pastiche-oriented. So if you're familiar with his Barack Obama Hope poster, that's pastiche. And most of his work is borrowing from earlier trends. Vernacular is using common everyday language or terminology or symbology that's used by a particular group. So either you're going to use a recognizable style that group understands, it's going to be a cultural or regional idea, cultural tradition. If you're speaking to Harley-Davidson owners, if you're designing something to reach that audience, you're going to use certain vernacular that they will connect with easily because they see that it relates to them, it's meaningful to them, they're going to take hold of it. So that is a recognizable style. It's a cultural tradition within Harley-Davidson owners. Same thing with people who buy their coffee at Starbucks and are very loyal to Starbucks. You're going to speak in the language and terminology visually that they understand. So here we have two different things. One is an advertising design, one is an editorial design, that both use vernacular in different ways. So the Texas Ranger cover takes a modern Texas Ranger and with some effective Photoshop maneuvers creates an image that recalls the history and the beginnings of the Texas Rangers. This is for a hotel that is reaching out to business people. So they're using a Mont Blanc pen. The hotel has an 11 in its name. So we have two pens forming an 11. It's very simple. It catches the eye, and it actually talks about the things that business travelers are concerned about. So let's go through and do a little bit of critical practice so that we're understanding how things are communicated in certain designs. Here we have another in the series of advertisements for Hotel 11. Instead of the pens, we have the cocktail hour martini olives, again creating an 11. But if you look at this and you look at this one, they're drawing from pictorial modernism. And this is a Lucien Bernhard advertisement for Priester matches from the early 20th century. And this is all hand done. It's hand lettering and hand illustration. And Lucien Bernhard was also not just an illustrator, or illustrative designer, he was a typeface designer. There are a lot of things in this, the way this is designed, and the form language that's used is based on the pictorial modernism era in that style. And you don't have to use a lot of copy with this to get your point across. So we have a lot of negative space. We have the double entendre of the toothpicks and the olives creating the number 11. And we have a simple tagline going horizontally. We've got this running vertically. This is centered within the design space. It is taller than it is wide. It's a tabloid type of size in terms of the design space. The negative space is as important as the positive elements. It is communicating what it needs to communicate using illustration. It's not narrative illustration, it's conceptual illustration. And then there's a minimal tagline, but it's going to reach the audience. This is Faber-Castell, and they make drawing pencils. And so they are playing off the idiom, to be or not to be, from Hamlet. That is the question. So this is very evocative. And again, it's in the style of pictorial modernism. It is therefore pastiche. This is a very powerful design. It's one of a series. There are, I think, 5 posters in this series, and the color is what basically changes out. His portrait is front and center, and he's looking very heroic. There's a lot of movement to the pose and the way it is cropped and clipped from the background. The background itself is evocative of African tribal design, surface design pattern. The colors used here, the red, the yellow, and the black and the white, pick up from those traditions. And the arrangement of the various letter forms also pick up from those traditions. Then we get a little bit postmodern in here, and then Swiss style in here. And there's a lot going on in here that is borrowing from a variety of past movements and current styles, all put together digitally into something that has high impact. And you look at this and you want to go hear this guy. You want to go buy tickets and go see his show. This is a 2-page spread from a multi-page oversized brochure promotion for a theater introducing various emerging playwrights. And so each page has a hero shot of the playwright in some sort of action, and then high energy, hand-drawn, hand-painted lettering is wrapping around, and then we have the quotes and the little bio. What's going on here is an understanding of similarity and proximity, of figure ground, of overall attention to the design space, filling the space in a way that is meaningful. There's a limited color palette so that we can focus in on particular things. Notice with him, the colors are a lot higher contrast. There's a lot more black and white here than there is with Anne. His pose is very direct and in your face. Hers is not directly engaging with you as the reader or the audience. She's actually looking up, a little more wistful. So there's a different personality between the 2 pages in the spread. The spread works together. We move from here up, around, and down. So there's a lot of connection, there's a lot of framing. Things are framed within the circle. Look at how the text box is framed within the gold, and it's framed down here. How she is framed by the hand lettering, how he is framed by the hand lettering, and again the text box, and how there's a movement across and a movement across. So the 2 pages are connected. All of this is to promote these up-and-coming, emerging playwrights in their significant debut opuses, and to get people excited, get the theater-going audience. It's messaging in a particular way. These are young people that are emerging, and their plays are being showcased here. So in conclusion, you need to be aware of trends and styles both currently and historically. You should acquire, borrow, and steal inspiration, but not directly copy it. Make it your own, make it new, make it fresh, combine it with other things for impactful, effective design. Engage and build your ability in attentive observation and critical practice. So attentive observation is looking at things to understand how they're created, what's going on, what design principles are in use, and why. And that way, once you start understanding and looking at things that way in your everyday comings and goings, you get used to seeing as a designer. And that way you can add to your own ability to create amazing, effective design. You should be following particular designers, illustrators, photographers, hand letterers, You should be curating, in other words, collecting imagery, throwing it up on Pinterest, creating mood boards, or categorizing and cataloging as inspiration to help give you ideas for designs. Make sure that you are deliberately and intentionally curating historic and current design and art. And build your critical thinking and problem-solving skills. Critical thinking is logical, systematic, but necessary to understand if this and that, then what's the outcome? Thinking things through, looking at something and being able to figure out how to make it work or how to make it happen. Much of your design process is going to be involved with figuring out how to create the design, not just following, but innovating within the process. Sometimes you're given a problem that's definitely solvable, but before you can actually go solving the problem, you have to figure out how to solve the problem. Your ability to think critically, to logically go from point A to point B to point C, and to see outcomes before they actually happen is crucial to being a high-quality, in-demand, sought-after, excellent designer. If your work is excellent and it's effective, you're not going to remain obscure. You're going to get noticed.